very thankful for all of you who are here, um, and for your participation, your ability to be here, and especially those like Mason here who have their things turned on, so it kind of helps humanize the whole experience, makes it easier for me to teach, when I'm not just looking at black boxes. So, hi. We'll get started in just a minute. I'm basically going to give you, I have more information to give you about your perusal assignments, and including your first one coming up that'll be due next week. And these are real important because they're the the basis for our weekly assignments, that you're going to be doing. And so I'll kind of like start by walking you through, our first kind of reading assignment, and hopefully that'll give you a clear sense of, what to do on these weekly assignments if you haven't used this program before, which, as I said last week, I have not. So, um, that'll be kind of, as I mentioned in the first class, that's kind of how we're going to spend a lot of time, in these live sessions, in these synchronous Zoom sessions, is kind of going through the reading, because, like I said, theory can be kind of difficult and kind of intimidating to read on your own. And so, one of you joked last week or last time, Monday, that it would be kind of like Bible study. And that's, like kind of half true in the sense that, like, we're going to be sort of breaking down some of these passages, and I'll be trying to give you some historical context and to sort of flesh out the meaning of some of these readings. And I hope that that'll be very, valuable for you, as opposed to trying to read and decipher these texts, on your own. I'm new to Chico, but I've been teaching theory for many years, so I have a pretty good understanding of these texts, and I think I can help you to understand them better. So let me just, take a bit of roll, just in the sense of I'm just writing down names of people who are here, to give you credit. Kai, can you tell me your last name?
Yeah, it's Grant.
Grant?
Grant. Uh-huh.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Of course.
Oh, yes, no. Same to you, Empress. Can you tell me your last name?
Aton, Aton.
Thank you, Empress. Okay. I'm going to go to screen share mode now and pull up your Canvas page, and then we'll go, into perusal. And this will be, again, a way of kind of walking you through the assignment and also getting us started with thinking about, like, what is theory? Why do we need theory? What can we do with theory? Those kinds of big questions that we're going to start the semester with. So let me go to screen share mode. Actually go this way. Can you all see my screen? So just give me a thumbs up or a
Yeah.
verbal yes. Yeah? Okay, thank you, Empress. Okay, so here's where we go into perusal. So you have basically two assignments for this week. One is the first one from perusal that just kind of walks you through how to make high quality comments. I would pay close attention to that because it's essentially like the algorithm telling you how to make comments in your reading that will score more highly. So the sort of the algorithm scores your, you know, the quality of your comments, and then I have kind of the last word in terms of manually moving that score up or down. But the first assignment, which is this one, making the most of learning with perusal, um, it looks like some of you have already done this, and you'll have to do it by a week from today. But it just kind of like walks you through different examples of what they mean by a high quality comment. And again, I would pay close attention to that because it's essentially showing you how to score more highly on these things. And then once you're done with that, then we move into the first reading assignment, which is about like what is classical social theory, and it's basically the introduction to your text. And so uh, the sort of prompt here is saying to read the entire chapter and make 7 what are called annotations. So annotations can be a comment, it can be a question, it can be an answer to a question that I have posed. So when we go through the reading here, you'll see that in a couple of spots, in like at least 2 spots, I have posed a question to think about. You can answer that as one of your 7 annotations. You can also skip it if you don't think you have like a good way to, a good response, or, if you're not entirely sure what I'm asking, or, something like that. You don't have to answer my question, but it's a way for me to kind of give you a lead in into an issue to think about. And usually there are questions that, don't necessarily have like a right or wrong answer. I'm asking you more to kind of like reflect. Like in this case, it'll be about the questions of like order and action, which are really central to social theory, these concepts of order and action. And then a final way that you can get an annotation is by answering other students' posts. So like if another student asks a question, or you kind of chime in with a similar thought about something that a student has highlighted, that can be another one of these 7 annotations. So your grade is basically based on the quality of these comments. And again, you should pay attention to the first assignment in making the most of perusal to know what a like high quality comment looks like. And then it'll also be based on your active engagement time and reading the entire document. So you can also boost your score by upvoting other comments, giving them a thumbs up or something of that matter, and then or writing a high quality comment, or maybe posting a question that other students respond to. So if like other people respond to your annotations, your comment or your question, then that increases your score. So my advice is to think about this as kind of what what Perusal is trying to sort of do, is to kind of mimic the way that we talk about things online, in social media, like where we comment and reply and then reply to a reply. And so to do that, I guess in a more friendly way than what often happens in social media. Often in social media, these so-called discussions end up being kind of hostile and volatile. So we want to do it in not that way. We want to do it in a more kind of like friendly, collaborative kind of way where we're all, kind of helping each other learn. So that's my advice as far as like how to approach it. I'm going to go ahead and open the assignment or the reading and show you how to, show you some examples of like how to comment on things. And also I'll kind of like walk us through the reading as a way uh, of introducing like the subject matter and the things that we're going to be talking about all semester. Before I do that, do we have any questions from those of you who are present so far, or things that are not clear, or things that maybe I can answer, maybe I can't? Any questions you want to throw either in the chat or here in person?
Yeah,
Okay,
hi, I have
I
a
mean,
quick question.
oh yeah, go for it, Jill.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Um, when you know what, I just actually popped into this, but my question has to do with like attendance, like if we can only attend like a certain portion. Would you rather me email you?
You mean like how much of it? Like if it's just like you're a couple minutes late,
Like
like
a
you are
like
today,
30 minutes.
that's not a problem. I'm sorry, I don't think I heard what you said.
I said like 30 minutes. Like I'm
Oh,
popping in on my lunch break.
yeah. So that's kind of a gray area. I mean, like the general policy is like that.
I
Um,
mean, I would for sure be like watching the rest of the class time on my own, so I can catch everything, but
okay. If that's the case, then I would allow it. The first few minutes of
yeah,
class are often very important
okay,
because that's like where I'm making like announcements,
okay.
and I want to make sure that you know the maximum number of people hear them,
Yes.
you know
Hmm.
and so as long as you can like kind of promise me that like like I'll post the lecture on Canvas, and you can just like watch the first 30 minutes or this part that you missed.
Okay, yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that kind of reminds me that we haven't been doing this yet, but the goal at in the CSU Chico sociology is for us to start uploading these video lecture sessions into Perusal, and to have students, if you're not here like in the synchronous session, you would have to watch the archive video and also like make maybe it's like some comments or questions in the same way that you would do with the reading. That's not going to be the case for this class this particular day, but they are kind of working on, I guess, getting some of the technical bugs out that would allow that to happen, maybe as soon as next week. um, I don't entirely know yet. But so that'll be, I guess that's a more important thing for those of you who are watching the archived versions of these classes, to realize that like if you're here synchronously, you wouldn't have to do that. I'll give you full credit for attendance. But for those who are watching the archive, in order for us to know that like you watched the lecture video, you'll have to like watch it through perusal with like some comments or something, just to know that like you were there, and that's how you'll earn your attendance and participation score. I hope that's clear. I'll hopefully have more information for you, in the next week or two to kind of clarify that policy, but that's sort of the way things are going to go. Okay. So let's see. Question. Okay, thank you, Paige. I hope that is clear. We're all kind of like, as I said last Monday, we're all kind of like learning on the fly here. And so this is like kind of a work in progress. So my goal is going to be as clear as humanly possible, as possible as I can be. So that's another way of saying like don't hesitate to ask questions. All right, so let's take a look at this reading, and I'll show you kind of what we have in mind. Okay, so let me just kind of like walk you through a little bit of this, and then I'll show you the examples of like comments that I've made and questions that I've posed. This starts off with this little story from Alice in Wonderland, and then it sort of hops into this question of like what is sociological theory, and so like it points out these two features that are common to both sociological and like theories that are found like around nature, like say like the theory of gravity, or the theory of relativity. And so basically all theories contain these two components. They try to explain and predict the phenomenon in question. So basically like, why are things happening the way that they are? And like what might happen next? And then secondly, to produce testable and thus falsifiable hypotheses. So theory, basically you can think of as like theory asks the big questions, with the big ideas. And then we go out and we try to find out, through collecting data, whether this is true or not. So this is what's known as a hypothesis, like an educated guess or like a bet, that we make about the way that we think things are. And then we go out and do the empirical research, whether that's a survey or a statistical analysis or field work or some other measure of collecting data in order to test that hypothesis, whether it's true or not, like the falsifiability of it. And so then they talk about, here Isaac Newton and his, sort of laws of motion as an example of, in physics, like a form of theory. And then in the second paragraph, they start talking about the significant differences between social and other scientific theories. So, i.e., theories in the social sciences as opposed to the natural sciences. So this is the question of like what makes sociological theory and social theory unique? What makes it different from like what Isaac Newton and physicists and these kinds of people to do? And they give you basically two reasons, two things that separate. All right. So this answer is first that sociological theories tend to be more evaluative and critical than theories in the natural sciences, and that sociological theories are often rooted in implicit moral assumptions that contrast with traditional notions of scientific objectivity. In other words, it is often supposed that the pursuit of scientific knowledge should be free from value judgments or moral assumptions, that the first and foremost concern of science is discover what is and not what ought to be. So in sociological theory, we are testing these theories and trotting out these theories, not just because like we want to, understand and know how the world works, but also because we have a sense of like what the way things should be. We have a kind of a moral assumption. And so the standards of objectivity are different from the natural to the social sciences. In the natural sciences, objectivity is really prized. In the social sciences, it's harder for us as people, as social scientists, to separate ourselves from the world that we're studying. And so objectivity is something that is, not as much to be kind of held up as a standard. All right. And that's what kind of the idea here explains here as this paragraph goes on, is kind of the difference between what social theories do versus what natural theories do around like this question of objectivity, and these as objectivity as a standard. The second difference stems from the fact that that the thing that we are studying, society, is always changing. So, like in nature, it's a pretty kind of static process, right? Like nature, doesn't change from century to century, right? But societies do. Um, in other words, we're kind of like, as social theorists, we're trying to understand a moving target, something that's always in motion. So, as it says here, societies are always in the process of change, while the changes themselves can be spurred by any number of causes, including internal conflicts, wars with other countries, scientific or technological advances, or the expansion of economic markets that in turn spread foreign cultures and goods. So these are all ways in which societies are constantly in motion. And so the thing that we're studying and trying to understand is like a moving target, in this sense that like it's never just like the same thing, in the way that like the law of gravity doesn't change over time. Like the law of gravity is the same today as it was, in Newton's time, in the 16th century. But the nature of societies is always under change. So this is a second important difference. So that kind of encapsulates this first session, this first section about what is sociological theory, and basically like what makes it different from nature. So if you were commenting on this, or if you had thoughts, for example, especially about like this question about objectivity, this would be a good thing, to maybe like comment on. The second part is just about like, why do we read these original works? I talked about this in the first class, like that we're going to be reading these original texts. They're all over 100 years old. They can be very difficult to grapple with on your own. That's hopefully what I'm going to help you do, is like to translate some of these works. it kind of talks about, basically the value of doing this. That yes, it is difficult and it's challenging and it can be a struggle. But we're also like wrestling with some of the most important and influential thinkers in the history of the world. And that, to me, is really what makes this such a fun class, is that we're like wrestling with these texts, again, in this kind of like Bible study kind of way that I hope that you will find illuminating. So the third section is the one where it starts to get really important. Now, this is where I'd like you to really read more closely. It's around these two concepts of action and order. And these are fundamental to understanding any society at any point in time, these questions of order and action. So the first question around order defines it here. The first question is that of order. It asks what accounts for the patterns of predictability or the patterns of predictability of behavior that leads us to experience social life as routine. So the question of order is kind of like, how is it that societies reproduce themselves over time? How is it that there's a kind of routine that is created day after day, month after month, year after year? What gives society a sense of order? What is the thing what are the things that hold societies together? No matter what society you're looking at, sociologists have to be able to explain this, have to be able to explain what is it that leads to social life, experience social life as routine. And I've posted down here a question for you. So this is an example of the kind of thing that you might do. Again, if you wanted to address the question, this could be one way in which you get one of your 7 annotations, but you don't have to do this. But it says, according to this definition, what is an example of collective order that you see in our society today? Something that is like predictable and routine. And in addressing this, keep in mind that like because something is orderly doesn't mean that it's just. We can have in fact, I would say that we do have a social order that is very unjust, that is inequality, that is unequal, and that perpetuates a routine of injustice in this society. And so one way in which you might think about the question of order is, how is it that we have a society where the billionaires have so much wealth and the vast majority of people are struggling to keep up? What are the mechanisms that reproduce that kind of inequality in society? How is it that we have this society where the nature of the routine seems to be that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? And that seems to happen generation after generation after generation. So, just because something is orderly does not necessarily mean like it's good. Whether it's a good order or a bad order, it's something that as sociologists, we have to be prepared to try to explain. So I've highlighted this section because it gives you a little bit more of a definition as to what they mean by this question of order. the pattern of social life, as it says here, that are the product of structural arrangements or historical conditions that confront individuals or groups. As such, pre-existing social arrangements produce the apparent orderliness of social life because individuals and groups are pursuing trajectories that, in a sense, are not of their own making. So like we inherit this world that shapes us and determines our lives in many cases, but that we didn't have any choice in its making. We just inherited the society. We didn't make it. We were just born into it. Society is thus pictured as an overarching system that works down on individuals and groups to determine the shape of the social order. Society is understood as a reality sui generis that operates according to its own logic, distinct from the will of individuals. The orientation has assumed many different names: macro, holistic, objectivist, structuralist, and the label we use here, collective or collectivist. So this is maybe something that you want to kind of reflect on, meditate upon, comment upon here in the assignment. But again, if you don't feel like you have good thoughts about this, or you'd rather weigh in on something else, you don't have to answer the question. Just giving that to you as a kind of a stimulus. Okay, so the second question, we have the question of order. And the second question is the question of action. And here the question of action is defined as considering the factors that motivate individuals or groups to act. The question of action then turns our attention to the forces held to be responsible for steering individual or group behavior in a particular direction. So this is the other thing that sociologists have to explain, is like, why do people do the things that they do? Not just individuals, but groups. Why do classes or ethnic groups or workers, or bankers or the military? Why do these groups act in the way that they do? And that is to ask a question of motivation, like, what are their motives? Are they pursuing money or wealth? Or are they following their moral compass, what they think is right? Or are they just like doing things? Are they just acting that way out of habit? Because that's just like the way that everyone they know has acted over time, just out of pure habitual. There's a lot of just action that is motivated just out of habit. So we have to be able to know not just like, what are people doing, how are people acting, but like, what are the motives? Why are they acting the way that they are? So these are the two sort of main axes. And here again, you'll see that I have posed a question. And it has to do with what are the motives of why people act in a certain kind of way. In order to address that question, I should go back to the paragraph before. And it goes into a question of like agency. All right. So this is a kind of a long running debate in sociology. Perhaps you've encountered it in other sociology courses that you've taken, about what's more significant, structure or agency. So for those who are on the side of explaining order, they tend to go for what we call like a structuralist explanation. that people act the way they are because the social system and the social order is designed to reproduce a certain routine over time. Those who favor the action sort of explanations tend to emphasize more like free will, what sociologists call agency, that people have more choice and responsibility for their actions. So if you're like an extreme structure argument would be that, you know, we're all as individuals, we're just kind of programmed or maybe like even brainwashed into following and reproducing this system, you know, these systems of capitalism and imperialism and such, you know, that we're all just kind of like robots, you know, who as individuals we're just kind of programmed that way. The other extreme would be that, you know, everything that people do is a product of their free will and their consciousness. You know, it's just people are making their own choices and responsibilities without any kind of influence from society. So those are obviously the extreme points of the spectrum, and the answer is somewhere in the middle. The answer, the debate is around like where in the middle between these two extremes do we fall? How much does the structure determine us as people, and how much like free will or agency do we have to make our own choices and responsibility? The way that Karl Marx puts this is that people make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing, right? So Marx believes that people have agency, they have free will to, like, for example, make a revolution or to go on strike or to take actions. People as individuals and people as groups have this kind of free will to act in the world. Marx does not think that we're just simply like programmed robots. But he says like we can act, but we don't do it under conditions of our own choosing. We inherit a certain kind of society, we inherit a certain kind of historical moment, you know, like it's kind of like players in a game, right? We can choose how to play, but we don't get to choose the rules of the game. The rules of the game were made up before we got there. And so the game kind of exists prior to us. You know, it's something that we inherit. And so the question is like, how are we going to play it? That's a way of thinking about Marx's idea that people make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. So this would be another interesting place for you to comment in your annotations, because it's around this very ancient philosophical idea about free will, and how much like free will do people really have versus how much are they kind of like programmed by society. All right. I'm kind of talking here a lot. If you want to hop in with a question or a thought or something that needs clarification, how are you all doing out there so far? All right. Well, I got one thumbs up. Thank you. Two thumbs up. Thank you. All right. Oh, look, you know, just like if you guys, it's like the format is a little strange, and I get tired of hearing myself talk after a while. So I may ask you to hop in with your thoughts, if for no other reason than to just like change things up a little bit. So feel free. But look, when it comes to action, oops, hold on. I put, like I said, this second question. The question around action kind of divides into two parts. Basically, like there are kind of two kinds of action that people can take based on their motives. And that is non-rational versus rational action. This is a question of like, what is the motivation behind action? And it says here specifically, if the motivation for action is primarily non-rational, the individual takes his bearings from subjective ideals, symbolic codes, values, morals, norms, traditions, the quest for meaning, unconscious desire, or emotional states, or a combination of these. All right, so non-rational action can be motivated by any of those things that are just listed in that sentence. And they're kind of non-rational in the sense that like they're not necessarily like calculated. You know, we might be acting based on a feeling, you know, like love or anger, you know, those motivate a lot of people's actions, right? Those kinds of feelings that may be connected with values, like if somebody, you know, doesn't respect your values and you get angry and that motivates you to act, you know, this would be an example of non-rational action.
I have a
As
question.
the passage continues here, while the non-rationalist orientation is relatively broad in capturing a number of motivating forces, the rationalist orientation is far less encompassing. It contends that individual and group actions are motivated primarily by the attempt to maximize rewards while minimizing costs. Here, individuals and groups are viewed essentially as calculating and strategic as they seek to achieve the selfish goal of improving their situation, their positions. Actors are seen as taking their bearings from the external conditions in which they find themselves rather than internal ideals. So when we're taking rational action, we're engaged in more what people call like a cost benefit kind of analysis, or other times people call it like a risk and reward kind of analysis. If we're in a rational situation of action, we're like, okay, I have this goal or this thing or this objective that I want, and what's the easiest or the less risky way of getting it? So when we're taking rational action, we're much more focused on, like a calculating mindset. Go ahead, Paige. Go ahead and ask a question.
Yeah, so just to kind of clarify, for the non-rational, would you say that they're pretty much acting off what they think they should do in that moment?
Yeah, but the point is that we all do both of these forms of action in our lives. Um, so it's a question of like, what are the situations or the people that we're dealing with when we're more likely to act in a non-rational versus rational way? So like if we're dealing with our parents, for example, we're more likely to be acting in a non-rational way that comes from more like emotions and values and norms. It'd be kind of weird to treat your parents in this kind of calculating, like, what can I get out of them kind of way, you know? Or like in our like romantic life and love, right? Like with our partners or, people that we're intimate with, we're to if you acted in this rational, calculating, weird way, it would be kind of like, psychopathic, Like you wouldn't want like a partner that treats you in this kind of cost benefit analysis way. I suspect that there are people out there that do that, but that's not the norm. We would expect people to act, less in terms of like, what can you do for me or what can I get out of you, and more around, our feelings and our emotions and our sense of like morals of, right and wrong, you know. And whereas like we're more likely to act in a rational way, in this calculating way, like when we're at work, when we're at our job, or like we're in a job interview and we're trying to get a raise or a promotion, or we're, maybe like in school, or, in line at the DMV, or, in some kind of institution where it's like we want to take this kind of calculating approach. So the idea is that we always, like all people, have moments where they act in non-rational ways, and moments where they act in rational ways. The question I posed for you to think about is, in what situations would you, or in what, either what situations or in interactions with certain kinds of people, like your parents, or, your partner, versus, at work, would you be more inclined to act, in a rational versus non-rational kind of way? Does anybody have thoughts on that? Like, in what other, I gave you a couple of examples, in what other kind of situations would you be more likely to act from a non-rational motivation, and in what kind of situations would you be more likely to act in a rational motivation? Does anybody have like an example that they can offer to the rest of us?
I can kind of give one.
Sure, great.
So I kind of grew up in like a dysfunctional family. So
Mm.
communicating with my parents is much different than how I might communicate with, even, funny enough, even my in-laws.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think I'm a little bit more structured with my in-laws versus my parents, because it can definitely get emotional given like the situations I've known with them. So that's kind of an example as well.
Yeah, that's where it can be really tough, is where, you have to act, with certain people, where you try to kind of bracket your emotions, if that's maybe what I'm hearing from you, Paige, and
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, right. Like where, that like if you act out of an emotional way, you're going to get like reactive and the situation's going to explode. And so you try to take this more kind of like calculating kind of approach. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant by that. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's a good kind of example. Um, Usually when we're acting in, a rational kind of motivation, it's usually like we have a certain goal or objective, a thing that we want, an end, and we're trying to calculate what's the best means of achieving that end. So usually the ends that motivate people in society, I mean, what do you think like motivates people in society most of the time? It's usually like money, um, fame, or power. Um, in the age of social media, people want, to be liked or to be followed. So if your goal is like, I'm going to build a social media profile, on TikTok or whatever, and like what's the fastest and cheapest and least risky way of achieving that goal, that's when we're acting in a kind of a rational way. Whereas non-rational, it's often coming from our emotions, our values. I keep coming back to, intimate partners and families and stuff, but there can be other situations where, you know, um, maybe you're like, I have to stand up for my values in this situation, even though, I might lose. I have to go protest, for example, the injustice of what's happening, even though I might get like arrested, or, I might get kicked out of school or something like that, where you are not acting in a calculating way. You're standing up for your values and your ideas and your symbolic codes, as it says here. Go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to tie back to it. So, like with what I said, like how I might act different with like my in-laws, would that kind of apply in a sense where you feel like maybe you might have to act that way so that in a sense they like you, so that somebody will like you. Would apply to that, or because you don't want
Yeah.
to
So
have I guess a bad impression is guess where I'm going with that.
say again, a bad
Like
impression.
like like avoiding a bad impression.
Yeah.
Kind of getting
Right.
it.
Right. So yeah, like if you're say going to court, or you're going to a job interview, you want to take that rational approach in terms of like how to you know how to make a good impression. I mean, that's your goal, right? That's the end that you're trying to achieve, and then you sort of calculate the means in terms of like what you wear, how you speak, all the ways in which people try to make a good impression in society. Mason, I think you had a question.
I was gonna ask, like, would that be something like, would a rational approach be like something you'd use in a job interview? But that was like the exact example you gave, so that kind of answered my question.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I'm glad you were thinking along the same lines. Um, so yeah, the thing is that we all have to act in this kind of rational way at least some of the time, right? I think that there are some like psychopaths that do it all the time. But those people are going to have like a hard time having relationships. If you were always calculating like, what can I get out of this person, how can this person help me meet my self-interests, that sort of thing, um you'd be more like a robot than a person. You'd be more like an AI generated, thing than a flesh and blood human being. What makes us flesh and blood human beings is that, a lot of times we act in kind of non-rational ways. And again, it's not a judgment. Sometimes we act in really stupid, non-rational ways where we get angry and we lose our temper, we start a fight, you know, we do things that are like self-destructive. Or sometimes we do non-rational things that are really noble. We stand up and, protest, and we stand up for what we think is right. So it's not a judgment one way or another. And we all have to, at some point, especially with the way that the society is, where it's more oriented around money and time and being exact, like we all have to be kind of like calculating and rational actors, at least some of the time, you know. So anyway, this is a question for you to think about. And again, one place where you could kind of try to answer, address these questions. The book, kind of continues with putting these on kind of two axes of non-rational versus, so this kind of charts the various theorists that we're studying this semester in terms of whether they emphasize collective or individual explanations for order. So someone like Karl Marx is on the collective side because he emphasizes that like capitalism is this system and it creates this routine kind of order. In his mind, it's a very unjust, exploitative order, one in which the wealthy get wealthy by exploiting the working class. But nonetheless, that is a system. That is a form of social order. That is a collective explanation for order. On the other axis, we have those who emphasize non-rational versus rational motivations for action. So we look at Emil Durkheim. He emphasizes a collective explanation just like Marx does, but he says that what motivates people is not necessarily like money and their self-interest, but rather their religious values, or their sense of social solidarity. So Durkheim thinks that, we are less motivated by like our material interests, which is what Marx emphasizes. And Durkheim emphasizes that, we are more motivated by our values, by our ideas, by our morality, by these kinds of things that are expressed in religion and maybe expressed in nationalism or patriotism or other kinds of collective order. So you see that basically all 5 of the people that we've studied this semester are really on the kind of collective side of things in terms of they emphasize like structural arguments for the way that society is. And where they differ is more around this axis of rational and non-rational, whether they emphasize like what motivations they emphasize for human action. We don't study so much Mead and Zimmel in this class, but they're in the textbook, they emphasize more of these kind of individual explanations. So that's like a roadmap for you to think about these thinkers in terms of these 2 questions of action and order. I wanted to make sure we're getting down to the last 15 minutes. So basically like this, they kind of flesh these out with a couple of examples. And one is like, consider this question: why do people stop at red traffic lights? Well, your motivation might be, like, I don't want to get in an accident. And like, you might have more of a rational, calculating way of thinking about it. Or you might have a more non-rational way that's like, that's just what people do. And that's what people are supposed to do, is to stop at a red light. It might be more out of like habit or out of like a moral, like this is the right thing to do. So that's one example that it gives you. And then so it kind of breaks these down into rational and non-rational, individual versus collective. So you can kind of use this example to think about these questions of action and order. And then it applies the questions of action and order to a second example, which is about the opioid epidemic in this country. And sort of starts off by kind of giving you the facts about the opioid epidemic, and then offers you different explanations that are encapsulated here, so that like a collective explanation would emphasize, the power of big pharma, insurance companies, the medical establishment, drug laws, international drug trade, employment opportunities. This would be kind of what we call like a more structural argument. And then also we can throw in these ideas about like peer pressure and moral order or bonds. Those are emphasizing kind of the non-rational aspects of the collective explanation, whereas those who emphasize the individual are more likely to point towards like individual responsibility and choice. You know, that individuals, we have so many opioid um, addicts in the society because people are choosing to take these things, and people are need to take more responsibility. So the individual explanation, I think, here is much weaker, and it's more kind of like this finger wagging, shaming, you know, kind of explanation that you hear a lot when people talk about drug addiction or the homeless or, you know, poverty. You know, the sort of the individual answer ends up usually like kind of blaming the victim, whereas the structural argument, the collective argument, tends to emphasize more of these structural social factors. So as sociologists, we tend to be more on the collective side of these questions of order rather than the individual side. Um, the reading then continues, and it looks into the next part is basically about the origins of sociology and where sociology came from. So this is like the historical part of this chapter that starts us with the Enlightenment and the social revolution. It goes, you know, way back to you know, in these periods of history. I've highlighted here a key section on how the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment challenged the church's power over knowledge of nature, humanity, and society. So the idea that's being explained here is that for most of, you know, this human history, this larger human history, um, the church, the religious authorities were the ones that were basically had a monopoly over how to explain why things happen, why nature is the way it is, why people are the way they are. You know, the church had a kind of a monopoly of explanation. And what happened with the scientific revolution and then later the Enlightenment is that you have these thinkers, these scientists, and philosophers who are questioning the church's authority and developing these scientific methods as a kind of an alternative to that. And as a result, those scientific thinkers were very controversial. Some of them were imprisoned, some of them were even executed by the church because they challenged the church's authority when it came to explaining, you know, that like, no, the world is round, it's not flat, and, you know, the earth orbits around the sun rather than vice versa. These kinds of insights were a real challenge to the religious way of thinking about things. And so I've highlighted this section here for you to think about. An additional question I might pose is like, are we still having that kind of debate in our society in 2025 that basically is around like science versus religion? You know, like the religious explanations for things versus the scientific explanations. In some ways, I would say that during COVID, we had a bit of a rejuvenation of that debate. You know, this thing about things about vaccines and masking and all this kind of thing. You know, there was a lot of criticism of science, particularly from more like evangelical parts of the society. Go ahead, Mason.
Would that also apply to like when, there's with the climate, there's more natural disasters on a larger scale, and you see a lot of like people saying, "Oh, this is punishment because people are doing X, Y, Z." Would that also like fall kind of into that same mindset?
Totally. Yeah, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that the scientific revolution is still not complete. The scientific revolution starts in about the 16th century with people like Isaac Newton in terms of presenting this like sort of scientific model as an alternative to religious authority and religious monopoly over knowledge. And I would say, though, that it's still being contested even in our time. That we're still seeing this debate, this sort of social struggle and conflict over knowledge, all of these decades later. And so this is a kind of thing that I would like you to think about. In fact, I'm going to um, put in a question here just as a prompt for that. So I'm going to highlight this part and then ask a question. This also hopefully shows you just basically kind of how to do this annotation things. Um, as a society uh, in 2025, are we still having this science versus religion debate or conflict? So that might be something for you to think about. And especially like, examples like the climate one, I think is a really is also a kind of a contentious issue along these lines. And the authority of science in this society is by no means complete. There's a lot of, again, as we saw during COVID, a lot of science skepticism. Um, and so that I think will be something that'll be really interesting for you to think about. Go ahead, Paige.
So this would be like totally like your opinion. But would you say that like in terms of like the science versus like religion debate, do you think that we could get more answers if they worked together rather than being absolutely no on both spectrums? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And there are some examples that I can think of right off, like around, say, the practice of meditation, right? So that scientists and spiritual authorities, more in the sort of Buddhist tradition, have worked together to document, for example, the positive aspects that meditation plays in people's lives. So the scientists have studied, like brain waves, in people's minds to see that it has these tangibly positive effects that people from the religious side of things, the spiritual side of things, have been saying for centuries. That meditation has these, and yoga and other kind of related practices, that they have these kinds of positive impacts. And the scientists have more recently kind of come on board to verify that, scientifically. So there is most certainly a way in which it's conceivable that these entities could work in a complementary, collaborative way. Um, I think that that's kind of the exception to the rule, which is that historically, at least to this point, it's been more of a relationship of antagonism
So
between the two
in
forces.
some sense, would you say that like maybe in some sense that we're kind of held back because of the ongoing debate from being able to
Yeah,
know more?
I honestly do, because the way I would put it is basically people feel like they have to choose one of two camps, and they have, or one of two tribes or teams to side with. And the thing about science is that it doesn't take into account like morals and values and, you know, these larger questions of meaning. And so science is also a kind of limited form of knowledge in some way, that would really benefit from having a conversation along the lines of, you know, something that's more kind of like spiritual, or, you know, that's informed by the values and morals and such. So I think science could be better if it was, you know, more engaged with these questions that religion engages with, like, you know, what is the meaning of life, and how how to be a good person, and, you know, how to treat other people. You know, those are the questions that, like, religion has all kinds of religions all over the world have struggled with and wrestled with, and that science kind of brackets out. And science is like, okay, well, you know, we just want the objective facts, you know, we just want the truth, as opposed to like the substance of you know, how to be a good person, and what to do. We will see that Max Weber is somebody who was especially concerned with this very thing, about this divide between, these two forms of knowledge, and how to kind of try to bring them together. So that's a really good question. Thank you. I much appreciate the questions and the participation. I am just looking through some of the comments. Yeah. Okay. We're about out of time, but
I do have one more question.
yeah, go for it.
Is this the entire reading that we're reading for the week? However many pages it is, or is there like a certain section that we're
No, this whole
so the
chapter.
whole thing? Okay.
Yeah. We didn't fully get to the end of it, but on Wednesday of next week, we can kind of pick back up with it based on the conversation that you all have. I've put in a few more comments here, but the main things that I kind of focused on were these questions of order and action. So there's some things here about the, you know, the limits of the Enlightenment, and these factors. But yeah, you should
Okay. And so is this like one chapter essentially?
yeah,
Okay.
essentially this is a full chapter. Yeah,
Okay, cool. Thank you.
you're welcome. I think we're about out of time. Very much appreciate those of you who are here. Antoine, what is your last name? Antoine, are you there? Okay. All right, well then I will
I think he put it in the chat.
oh, he did. Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me?
I see, it's lax. Okay, thank you. All right. I will see you all. Have a good holiday. I'll see you a week from today. And we'll keep going with this reading, okay?
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
All right. Thank you again for
Thank you, Professor.
questions and your participation.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Have a nice afternoon, sir.
Thank you. Bye.